He sat there stunned, the words slicing through him like a blade. His daughter-in-law Melissa told him he wasn't welcome at Christmas, and his own son Eric said nothing. For decades, David Harris had sacrificed working long nights, draining his savings, secretly covering their mortgage so they could live in comfort. And now, cast aside like an outsider in the very family he built, he felt humiliation burn into rage. If he wasn't good enough for their holiday table, he wasn't good enough to fund their roof. What he did next would turn their perfect world upside down. Keep watching. From the day Eric was born, David Harris's life became a chain of sacrifices strung together by love. When Eric was 3 and the wheeze of asthma clutched his tiny chest in the dead of night, David rushed him to the emergency room more times than he could count. He learned to sleep upright in a hospital chair, his hand always resting on the boy's back to feel every breath, every rise and fall. The sound of machines pumping the antiseptic sting of the ER, the way nurses nodded at him like he was part of the furniture, those became the rhythm of his nights. And every time Eric opened his eyes and whispered, "Dad," it erased the exhaustion. Love made those long nights bearable. When his wife Karen passed too soon, the house hollowed into an echo chamber of grief. David buried his sorrow under endless hours of work, just to keep moving, just to keep Eric from seeing the crack in his armor. He saved every dollar he could, refusing vacations, driving a battered truck, well past its prime, wearing out shoes, until the soles split. It wasn't sacrifice in his mind, it was duty, the kind a father bore with pride. He promised himself Eric would never feel the weight of want, never sense the limitations of money the way David had growing up. He remembered Eric's first computer, a clunky desktop that ate most of a year's savings. David had worked 2 extra jobs, scrubbing offices after midnight and hauling supplies for a contractor on weekends. He still remembered carrying the box into the living room, watching Eric's eyes light up like fireworks. That glow made every hour of fatigue vanish. Later came the coding camps that cost more than David could afford. He worked overnight shifts, nodding off on the bus home, but he still showed up for Eric's Saturday practices with a smile and a thermos of coffee to keep his body from betraying his exhaustion. It was love disguised as labor. And when Eric graduated from college, crossing the stage in that stiff black gown, David clapped so hard his palms stung. Eric hugged him and said he couldn't have done it without him, and for a moment David believed every sacrifice had finally been worth it. But love in David's life was never simple. Karen's absence left a scar that never closed, and in that empty space grew a devotion that bordered on desperation. He was determined that Eric would never feel abandoned, never left to weather storms alone. So when Eric met Melissa, a woman whose sharp smile and sharper eyes scanned rooms like a critic, David tried to welcome her. He tried to ignore the way she dismissed his modest house, the way her parents, Gregory and Elaine, carried themselves as if money gave them authority over dignity. He told himself it was enough that Eric was happy enough that his son had found someone to share his life with. David endured the quiet humiliations, Melissa's glances at his worn furniture, Gregory's offhand remarks about neighborhoods on the wrong side of town, Elaine's perfumed laughter that carried judgment beneath its sweetness. He endured because Eric was smiling, because love had taught him to bear the unbearable. And when the calls started, first a few thousand for unexpected taxes, then another 5 to cover Melissa's new certification, then more for furniture that gleamed while David's own sink leaked, he didn't hesitate. He transferred money without question, drained his savings without complaint, and pushed his aging body into more shifts than men half his age could stand. At 60, he was working like a young man chasing a dream. But his dream wasn't for himself. It was for Eric, for the boy he once carried through hospital doors in the middle of the night. That boy had grown into a man who now stood in homes worth more than David could ever fathom, homes filled with marble and glass, while David's own walls cracked and sagged. Yet David told himself it was enough because his devotion wasn't a burden. It was love. But love had a cost, and David was paying it in silence. His neighbors saw him leave before dawn and return long after dark, his frame bent a little more each year. Friends invited him to dinners to holidays, but he declined, saving every penny for a future that no longer belonged to him. The house that once rang with Karen's laughter now only echoed with the hum of an old refrigerator and the soft shuffle of his tired steps. He told himself it was temporary. Eric just needed a leg up, just needed breathing room. Melissa's family might sneer, but David's sacrifice would prove the strength of a father's devotion. Someday he believed Eric would look back and see what it had cost. Someday he would understand. Yet deep down a shadow grew. Each time Melissa's voice on the phone grew sharper, each time Eric spoke like the mortgage was David's responsibility, the shadow spread. Gratitude was shrinking. Respect was evaporating. And still David gave. Still he drained himself. Because that was what fathers did, wasn't it? They gave until there was nothing left to give. But devotion without respect becomes a chain. And chains, even when forged in love, can turn into shackles. David didn't see it yet, not fully, but the day Melissa's words cut him out of Christmas would be the moment those shackles shattered. For now he held on working, giving, loving, convincing himself that family was worth any price. What he didn't know was that the bill for his devotion was about to come due, and when it did, the cost would tear his world apart. After Karen passed, silence became the loudest sound in the house. Every corner of the place David Harris once called home turned into a reminder of what he had lost. The kitchen where Karen used to hum while stirring a pot of soup now carried only the echo of a clock ticking too slowly. Their bedroom, once filled with warmth, felt cavernous, the empty side of the bed a grave reminder that no one would ever return to it. Even the scent of her perfume clung stubbornly to the fabric of an old coat hanging in the closet, as if daring him to forget. The house was too big for one man, too heavy with memories that no longer comforted but mocked. At 62, David had expected companionship in his later years. He imagined evenings with his son dropping by, grandchildren racing through the hallway, Karen beside him telling him to slow down and enjoy it. Instead, he sat alone at a dinner table meant for four, pushing food around a plate, listening to the hollow thud of his fork on porcelain. He tried to fill the silence with television, leaving the set on for hours, even when he wasn't watching. He turned on the radio just to hear voices, though none of them spoke his name. Sometimes he'd wander into Eric's old room, still lined with trophies from high school soccer, and sit on the bed as if the boy might walk in at any moment and flop down beside him. But Eric didn't come. The room was a museum of a life David had sacrificed everything to nurture, a museum no one else visited. The grief sharpened in quiet ways. David found himself speaking aloud just to cut through the emptiness, asking Karen questions he knew would never be answered, telling her about his day, whispering her name when the weight of the night pressed hardest on his chest. At times he swore he heard her laugh, faint and fleeting, like a memory sliding down the hallway, only to realize it was nothing more than the creak of old wood settling. It was in those moments of hollow solitude that the weight of his choices pressed down on him. He had given everything to his family, years of labor, nights of lost sleep, dreams deferred, and now he had nothing but four walls and shadows for company. He thought his son would be his anchor, the one to steady him through the storms of old age. But Eric was drifting further into another world, one that David had financed but could no longer enter. Holidays were the worst. Thanksgiving dinners that once filled the house with chatter now passed with David heating a frozen meal and forcing down every bite. Birthdays came and went with no candles, no voices singing his name, only the buzz of a text message that sometimes arrived late at night when Eric remembered. He told himself it was enough, that at least there was contact. But when the phone buzzed with Melissa's name instead of Eric's, when the words were transactional, asking for help or reminding him about money, the truth stabbed deeper. He wasn't a father anymore. He was an account number. Outside, the neighbors' houses glowed with lights, laughter spilling through their open windows. David would catch glimpses of families gathering around tables, children tugging at their parents' sleeves, dogs barking for scraps. He'd pull his curtains closed, shutting out the world that reminded him of what he lacked. Inside, the shadows grew longer, the silence heavier. Yet even in his solitude, David clung to the belief that things could change. He kept Eric's favorite cereal stocked in the pantry as if his son might stop by one morning. He left the porch light on during the holidays, waiting for footsteps that never came. Hope, fragile and stubborn, lingered in his chest. But each year the light dimmed, replaced by the cold reality that his sacrifices had not built a bridge, but a chasm. Loneliness doesn't just sit quietly in a room, it seeps into a man's bones. David felt it in the way his shoulders slumped when he unlocked the front door, in the heaviness of his steps up the staircase, in the ache that no doctor could cure. It wasn't just the absence of his wife or the distance of his son. It was the realization that everything he had poured into others had left nothing for himself. The nights grew longer, and with them came the memories. Karen's laughter as she burned the first Thanksgiving turkey. Eric's small hand gripping his when they crossed the street. The way they had once sat together on the porch, watching summer storms roll in. These memories circled him like ghosts, not bringing comfort, but reminding him of what could never return. He drank his coffee cold, let the mail pile up on the counter, and lived in a house that was no longer a home, but a mausoleum of love gone to dust. He thought this was how it would be until the end, quiet, gray, and forgettable. But fate has a way of bending the story when a man believes the script is finished. And for David Harris, the storm was only beginning to gather. What came next would not be silence. It would be fire. Do you want me to continue with the next part, where the influence of the in-laws begins to twist the knife even deeper? When Eric married Melissa, the fracture that had once been invisible widened into a chasm. David Harris felt it the first time Melissa brought her parents Gregory and Elaine into his modest living room. Gregory's handshake was firm but perfunctory, his eyes scanning the worn carpet and faded curtains with thinly veiled disdain. Elaine's smile was polished, but her gaze lingered too long on the old family photos and secondhand furniture, her silence louder than words. David had spent a lifetime turning that house into a home, a fortress of sacrifice and love. But in their eyes it was nothing more than a relic, something beneath the family their daughter had chosen to marry into. At first David tried to shrug it off. He told himself people came from different worlds, that maybe he was just being sensitive. But the signs kept multiplying. When wedding plans began, Melissa's parents took control as if it were their right. The venue was their choice, a country club that reeked of exclusivity. The flowers, the catering, even the band. Everything was dictated by Gregory and Elaine, who spoke as though David's role was to nod, smile, and sign checks. When he offered to contribute to host even a small piece of the rehearsal dinner, Elaine placed a manicured hand on his arm and suggested he handle something small like assembling favors. The words stung, but he swallowed them. For Eric's happiness, he told himself he could endure. The wedding itself was a spectacle. 7 bridesmaids in gowns worth more than David's car ice sculptures melting under chandeliers. Champagne poured into crystal flutes that seemed too fragile to touch. David wore his best suit, the one Karen had once said made him look strong, but under the glare of the Parker family's wealth, he felt diminished. Eric, caught in the tide of Melissa's world, floated farther from his father's orbit. The son who once clung to David's side at family gatherings now spent the evening surrounded by Melissa's relatives, laughing at jokes David didn't understand, raising glasses in toasts. David was never asked to join. It didn't stop there. When Eric and Melissa began house hunting, they invited David along as if extending a courtesy. The house was in Lakeview Estates, sprawling and pristine, its price tag large enough to choke him. Melissa's smile gleamed as she spoke of open floor plans and imported fixtures, her parents promising to handle the down payment. David stood in the background, hands shoved in his pockets, feeling smaller with every word. His warnings about budget, about practicality, were dismissed with polite nods. When Melissa said, "My parents are helping us," it was both a reassurance and a subtle reminder of where the true power lay. The gap widened into exclusion. Decisions were made without him, gatherings arranged where his presence was optional. He was invited to dinners only when Melissa and Eric needed to smooth over requests for money. His modest home, once the center of every birthday and holiday, now seemed forgotten, replaced by the grandeur of the Parkers' dining room with its long mahogany table and crystal chandeliers. David sat at that table once out of courtesy while Gregory spoke loudly about stock portfolios and Elaine detailed their latest vacation to Europe. David sipped his water in silence, feeling the weight of their unspoken judgment pressing against his chest. It wasn't just their wealth, it was their power. Gregory and Elaine wielded influence like a weapon, subtly reminding Eric where his future lay. Gregory dangled business opportunities, speaking of connections Eric could leverage, while Elaine draped her approval over Melissa like a crown. David watched as his son leaned into their orbit, each promise of advancement pulling him farther away. The father who had once been Eric's anchor now felt like ballast to be cut loose. And David knew it. He felt the unease settle deep in his bones, the resentment curling like smoke. Still, he told himself it was worth it. If Eric was happy, if he was thriving, perhaps that was enough. But every time Melissa's mother tilted her head in faux sympathy, every time Gregory's voice sharpened, when David offered an opinion, it became clearer he was no longer part of the family he had built. He was a relic tolerated when convenient, useful, only when his checkbook opened. The shift became undeniable the first time Eric asked for help with the mortgage. He came alone, sitting at the same kitchen table where David had once helped him with homework, his voice tight, as he explained the payments were too high. Melissa's parents had contributed to the down payment, but now the burden was heavy, and they couldn't cover it. Eric's eyes, once so bright with ambition, looked worn, pleading. David's chest ached, torn between pride and sorrow. He wanted to say no, to remind Eric that adulthood meant responsibility. But the words died on his tongue. He agreed because he remembered the boy gasping for air in the ER, the boy who once said, "Dad, I couldn't do this without you." From then on, the pattern was set. Gregory and Elaine's wealth made Melissa and Eric feel entitled to live above their means, and David's quiet sacrifices became the safety net. Each payment pushed him further into exhaustion, each request widened the wound. And while he bore the weight silently, Melissa's parents watched from a distance, secure in the knowledge that their daughter would never truly struggle, not while David was still breathing. The resentment built quietly like water rising behind a dam. David smiled at birthdays, handed over envelopes, nodded, when Gregory boasted about business deals. But inside he felt the steel of exclusion cut deeper. He was no longer family. He was support invisible unless needed. And when Melissa's voice finally told him he wasn't welcome at Christmas, it wasn't just her rejection he heard. It was Gregory and Elaine's judgment, their wealth, their disdain echoing through her words. What David didn't yet know was that the dam was close to breaking. Years of humiliation, sacrifice, and silent exclusion were about to collapse under the weight of a single decision. And when it did, the Parker family would learn that even a quiet man has limits, and his revenge would be nothing they saw coming. For 3 relentless years, David Harris bled himself dry to keep his son's dream alive. Every month, the mortgage payment loomed like a shadow over his modest kitchen table, a figure that dwarfed his own expenses, yet he paid it without hesitation. The transfers became routine, almost mechanical, his fingers moving across the checkbook or the online portal, while his chest grew heavier with each transaction. He told himself it was temporary, that Eric and Melissa would regain their footing, that his sacrifice was only a bridge. But bridges can collapse under the weight of those who refuse to walk on their own. The irony gnawed at him. As Melissa tore out perfectly good hardwood floors because the color didn't suit her vision, David lived with a bathroom sink that leaked in a steady drip, drip, drip that mocked him in the quiet of the night. They replaced countertops with marble-hung chandeliers that glittered like ice while he taped up drafts around his own windows and postponed repairing the roof that sagged under heavy snow. They bought a new sectional sofa from a showroom in the city, while David ate canned soup for dinner, sometimes skipping meals entirely just to save a few dollars. He worked 60-hour weeks, sometimes 70, surviving on bitter coffee and willpower, telling himself this was what fathers did. The hospital hallways became his second home. His footsteps echoed down sterile corridors at 2 in the morning, his eyes red-rimmed as he checked charts under flickering fluorescent lights. Younger nurses looked at him with pity, whispering that he should slow down, but he brushed them off. He could not slow down. Every overtime shift was another month of shelter for Eric and Melissa, another reprieve from the consequences they refused to face. His own body paid the price. His back ached. His hands trembled after long shifts, and the fatigue seeped into his bones until he could barely climb his own stairs. Still, when his paycheck landed, he knew exactly where the money would go. Holidays that should have been joyous only highlighted his exhaustion. He'd drag himself to Eric's house, where Melissa unveiled her latest redesign with the flourish of a stage actress. "We wanted something more contemporary," she would say, gesturing at a living room dripping in designer touches. Eric would nod along, beaming with pride as if the house had transformed itself by magic. David would smile, swallow his bitterness, and comment politely on how beautiful it looked. No one asked how his own house was holding up. No one noticed the lines etched deeper into his face. Bitterness crept in quiet but steady. Each time he opened his wallet, he felt a sting of humiliation. It wasn't gratitude he received, but expectation. Melissa's tone on the phone had shifted from polite requests to clipped reminders. Eric's voice, once soft with embarrassment, hardened into casual entitlement. They no longer said thank you. They no longer pretended it was temporary. The money was theirs before it even left his hands, as if his labor existed solely to fund their comfort. And still David told himself this was love. He remembered Eric as a boy wheezing in the back seat as he sped to the ER, remembered how small and fragile he had looked hooked up to oxygen. That memory fueled him on nights when his body screamed to stop. But as he sat in his darkened kitchen, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, another thought began to creep in. Love was supposed to be reciprocal. Sacrifice was supposed to mean something. What did it mean when the people you bled for barely looked at you anymore? The spiral tightened around him like a noose. His savings account dwindled to nearly nothing, the numbers dropping month after month until the cushion he had built for his own future was gone. He began to fear the mail, worried that an unexpected bill for his own house would tip him into ruin. He let his car go without maintenance until it coughed on cold mornings, praying it would start so he could make his shifts. The thought of retirement, once a fragile dream, evaporated. He would work until he collapsed, and even then, would they notice? Or would they just ask who was going to cover the next payment? There were moments late at night, lying awake in an empty bed, when he wondered if Karen would have approved. Would she have told him to stop to protect himself? Or would she have urged him to keep going for Eric's sake? The silence gave him no answers, only the hollow ache of solitude. It was in that silence, though, that a dangerous clarity began to form. He was killing himself to protect a family that had stopped treating him as family. He had traded his health, his savings, his peace for their comfort, and in return they excluded him from decisions, from celebrations, from the very life he had given them. The sacrifices that had once felt like love now felt like shackles binding him to a role he no longer wanted to play. And yet, despite the exhaustion, despite the bitterness that curled tighter with every slight, David couldn't let go, not yet. Something inside him still clung to the hope that Eric would wake up, that Melissa's sharp edges would soften, that one day they would look at him with recognition instead of expectation. That hope, fragile as it was, kept him moving, kept him working, kept him giving. But hope can be the cruelest weight of all. For David Harris, the spiral had not yet reached the bottom. He didn't know it, but the breaking point was coming, and when it arrived, it would not be quiet. It would be a fracture loud enough to shatter the illusion of family once and for all. The sickness crept in slowly at first, just a nagging cough that David Harris dismissed as fatigue from too many overnight shifts. But when the fever came, when his chest tightened and every breath rattled with effort, he knew it was more than exhaustion. The doctor's diagnosis was clear pneumonia, compounded by years of overwork and a body pushed past its limits. For the first time in years, he was ordered to stop. Bed rest, no overtime, no pushing through. The doctor's words echoed in his ears as he sat alone in his dim bedroom, the walls closing in tighter than the illness itself. For weeks he had carried their mortgage like a cross, every payment ripping a piece of his own future away. Now, lying under blankets damp with sweat, he realized he couldn't carry it, not this month. He rehearsed the words in his head, the request that should have been simple, the plea any decent child would understand: just one payment, just this once while he recovered. He reached for the phone with trembling fingers, dialing his son's number, praying for compassion. Melissa answered instead. Her voice was cool, sharp as glass. He cleared his throat, explained the pneumonia, the doctor's orders, his inability to pick up the extra shifts that usually covered their mortgage. He expected shock, concern, maybe even guilt. Instead came silence. Then the words that sliced through him like a blade. So you're not sending money this month? Not a trace of worry, not a question about his health, just disappointment that the payment would not arrive on schedule, as if his labor and sacrifice had been nothing but a standing order, a service disrupted by his inconvenient illness. In that instant, years of fatigue and humiliation crystallized into something hotter, sharper. Disbelief gave way to anger, his pulse hammering in his ears as he tried to process the cruelty behind her tone. He reminded her gently, though his voice shook, that he had been paying for 3 years. That he had kept them in that sprawling house, drained his savings, worked until his body broke. Melissa's laugh, short and dismissive, burned in his ear. She reframed his sacrifices as obligations, claimed he was only doing it to stay involved in their lives, accused him of leveraging his illness to control them. Each word landed like a slap. It wasn't just her contempt that hollowed him out, it was Eric's silence. For 3 days his son didn't call back, not until the pressure from the bank forced him to pick up the phone. When Eric finally did, his voice was rushed defensive. He echoed Melissa's tone, speaking of commitments, of obligations, of the embarrassment a missed payment might bring. And when David reminded him of the years he had carried their weight, of the meals skipped and the health he had lost, Eric's reply came cold and cruel. So you're keeping track. I thought you were helping because you wanted to, not because you expected something in return. It hit him harder than the pneumonia ever could. His own son, the boy whose life he had guarded with sleepless nights in hospital rooms, now spoke to him like a creditor haggling over terms. Gratitude was gone. Respect was gone. All that remained was expectation. The kind of entitlement that made love feel like a burden, devotion feel like debt. David hung up the phone that night with a clarity that cut through the fever haze. He lay in his bed, coughing until his chest ached, staring at the ceiling where shadows crawled across the plaster. The truth was undeniable now. They didn't see him as a father. They saw him as a checkbook, a steady transfer, a man whose life had been reduced to direct deposits. And when that transfer failed, when the money stopped, so did their pretense of care. Anger curled inside him, hot and steady, burning away the weakness. The humiliation of Melissa's laugh, the coldness of Eric's tone, the sheer audacity of their ingratitude, it lit a fuse that had been smoldering for years. For 3 decades he had been the provider, the safety net, the man who bent until his back nearly broke. But now, for the first time, he saw what bending had cost him. He had given until he was empty, and they had filled the void with contempt. As the night dragged on, he began to plan. Not revenge, not yet, but survival. He thought of the savings he had left dwindling to crumbs. He thought of the years lost, the future slipping from his grasp. And he thought of his wife Karen, the way she had looked at him with quiet pride, the way she had believed in his strength. Would she have wanted him to die this way, working himself into the grave for a son who couldn't even ask about his health? By morning the fever had eased slightly, but the decision had hardened. He would not send another payment. He would not bleed himself dry for people who treated him as less than human. As he brewed weak coffee and sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he had once cradled Eric's small hands while teaching him arithmetic, he felt a shift inside. The man who had carried his family's burdens was gone. What remained was something leaner, sharper, unwilling to be used. The phone buzzed again that day, messages piling up, Eric's tone growing more desperate with each one. David ignored them. For the first time in years he felt a flicker of power. They needed him. And for the first time he would let them feel what it was like to stand without him. What David didn't know was that this single act of defiance would set off a chain reaction. The in-laws, the ones who sneered at his modest home while dining under chandeliers, would soon step into the fray. And when they did, David Harris would discover just how deep their contempt ran, and just how far he was willing to go to finally reclaim his dignity. The fever had broken, but the clarity remained sharp as glass. David Harris lay in the narrow bed sheets, damp with the residue of sickness, the ceiling above him fractured by shadows from the street lamp outside. His body was weak, ribs aching with every cough, but his mind had never been clearer. In the quiet hum of his empty house, the truth pressed down on him with a weight more suffocating than pneumonia ever could. He wasn't a father anymore, not in their eyes. He was an account number, a balance sheet, a reliable monthly deposit disguised as a man. Every sacrifice, every night shift, every skipped meal, all of it had been rebranded by Eric and Melissa as obligation. He thought back to the way Melissa's voice had curled into a sneer on the phone, the way Eric's silence had allowed her cruelty to stand unchallenged. They weren't grateful. They weren't even ashamed. They had erased him, carved him down to the bare function of his labor. And the bitter truth seared through him, he had let them. The realization was cold, almost clinical. He replayed the last 3 years in his head, each payment like a nail hammered into his own coffin. He had built their comfort at the expense of his own survival, and in return they had stripped him of dignity. He had clung to the hope that love would redeem the sacrifice, that someday Eric would see the man behind the money. But hope was a liar, and David finally understood he had been complicit in his own erasure. That night, as the wind rattled the windows and his lungs rasped for breath, David decided the chain would break. The next payment would never leave his account. It wasn't rage that drove the decision. It was something colder, more deliberate. Rage is fire, but clarity is steel, and steel endures. He rose from bed slowly, his legs trembling under the weight of weakness and resolve. The house groaned around him, a tired structure that had weathered storms with him for decades. He shuffled to his desk, opened the drawer where his checkbook sat, and stared at it for a long moment. That little blue book had been the instrument of his slow undoing, the silent accomplice in his humiliation. His hand hovered above it, then closed the drawer with a finality that echoed louder than the slam of a door. For the first time in years, he felt something close to relief. The dread of the mortgage deadline evaporated. The looming anxiety that had stalked him each month dissolved into silence. He would not give them another dollar. Let them scramble. Let them learn what it felt like to stand without his labor propping them up. He spent the following days recovering his strength, returning in small increments. Each breath came easier, each step steadier. With his health creeping back, so did his resolve. He began to notice things he had ignored in his exhaustion. The peeling paint on his front porch, the stack of unpaid repair bills for his own home, the photographs of Karen gathering dust on the mantel. He realized he had been so consumed with holding up Eric's world that he had abandoned his own. One evening, as the sun sank low and bathed the kitchen in amber light, he sat at the table with a cup of coffee and thought of Karen. He could almost hear her voice, steady and certain, telling him he had given enough. She would have reminded him that dignity wasn't a luxury, it was survival. He pictured her hand on his shoulder, not guiding but grounding, reminding him of the man he was before exhaustion hollowed him out. The thought steeled him further. When Eric finally called again, his tone was clipped, frustrated. "Dad, the bank called. The payment's late." "What happened?" David listened, let the words wash over him, then answered with a calm that unnerved even himself. "What happened is I'm done." There was silence on the line, then Eric's indignant sputter. "You can't just stop, Dad. We'll lose the house." David's reply was simple, steady. "Then lose it. It was never mine to keep for you." He hung up before his son could answer. That night he slept without nightmares for the first time in years. The house was still empty, still haunted by Karen's absence, but it felt different. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful, the quiet of a man reclaiming his life. David knew the storm hadn't passed. Melissa wouldn't let the matter die, and Gregory and Elaine would soon sharpen their knives. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He had clarity, he had resolve, and he had nothing left to lose. The man they thought they could reduce to an ATM was about to remind them what happens when you strip a father of his dignity. And when the in-laws came to his door with their polished shoes and practiced disdain, they would find a man who no longer bent a man ready to face them without fear. The real battle was about to begin. It happened on a gray morning when the air hung damp with the smell of rain. David Harris was pouring himself a second cup of coffee when a car pulled into his driveway. Black and polished its engine, purring like entitlement itself. He didn't need to look twice. Only one man in his orbit arrived in a machine like that: Gregory Parker, the father-in-law, whose smile carried more arrogance than warmth. The man stepped out wrapped in a fine coat that probably cost more than David's monthly wages, his shoes clicking against the pavement like punctuation marks of superiority. Gregory didn't waste time with pleasantries. He climbed the porch steps with the air of a man about to settle a trivial matter, as though David were a subcontractor late on a bill. When David opened the door, the scent of cologne rushed in sharp and suffocating. Gregory's smile was thin, calculated, and his words slid out as if rehearsed. He spoke of Eric and Melissa's financial strain, of how important it was to keep appearances intact, how losing the house would be unfortunate for everyone. Then came the offer slipped between sentences like poison in a glass of wine. Gregory would cover David's expenses if David agreed to continue making the mortgage payments for his son. For a moment, David just stood there staring at the man who treated him like a tool to be bartered. Fury rose slow but undeniable, hot enough to burn through every layer of exhaustion and doubt that had weighed him down. The arrogance of it, this man who had mocked his modest home, who had flaunted his wealth while David starved himself to keep Eric's roof intact, now standing on his porch offering a bribe as if David's dignity could be bought. He had bent for years, sacrificed until there was nothing left to give, but in that instant something inside him snapped into steel. His voice was steady, stripped of apology when he said no. Just one word, but it carried the weight of every sleepless night, every dollar drained, every humiliation endured. Gregory's smile faltered. He wasn't used to refusal. He wasn't used to men like David looking him directly in the eye without flinching. Gregory pressed his tone, sharpening, reminding David of Eric's responsibilities, Melissa's expectations, the family's reputation. He spoke as though David owed them, as though his labor was a permanent debt to be collected. But David didn't waver. For the first time in years, pride flared in his chest, stronger than fear. He told Gregory that his days of carrying their burden were over. That if Eric and Melissa wanted the house, they could pay for it themselves. That his love for his son had been twisted into servitude, and he would no longer be shackled by it. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with disbelief. Gregory's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing into the cold gray of a man unaccustomed to losing ground. But David didn't care. He had spent too long in the shadows of other people's expectations. Now, standing in the doorway of his own battered home, he felt taller than he had in years. Gregory eventually turned his coat, swaying as he descended the steps, his voice low and sharp with threat. "You'll regret this," he said, but the words slid off David like rain on stone. He closed the door slowly, deliberately, letting the echo ring through the house. It wasn't just a door shutting on Gregory. It was a door shutting on years of humiliation. David leaned against the wood, his heart pounding not from fear, but from release. He had said no, and the world hadn't ended. Instead, he felt lighter, stronger, as though the weight he had carried had finally been set down. For the first time, he wasn't the man who bent. He was the man who stood. That night, as he sat alone in his kitchen, the air felt different. The silence was no longer oppressive but charged alive with possibility. He poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, hands steady, and allowed himself a rare smile. They would come back, of course. Melissa with her venomous words, Eric with his misplaced anger, maybe even Elaine with her polished cruelty. The Parkers wouldn't surrender easily. But David was ready. He had found his spine again, and once a man stands, there's no forcing him back to his knees. The storm was still gathering, but he welcomed it now. For years he had lived in fear of losing them, fear of being alone. But he saw the truth with piercing clarity. He had already been alone, and surviving it had made him stronger. Whatever came next, he would face it with defiance, with pride, with the unshakable knowledge that he was no one's servant. And when Eric finally called, voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief, David knew the real battle was only beginning. The son he had sacrificed everything for was about to hear the truth in words sharper than any blade. "Do you want me to carry the story forward into the next moment?" When Eric's cold words finally sever the bond between father and son. The call came just after sunset, when the house was already cloaked in shadows and David Harris was finishing a simple dinner at his worn kitchen table. The phone rattled across the wood, its shrill ring slicing through the quiet. He knew who it was before he picked it up. Eric's number lit the screen, and with it came a heaviness in his chest. He answered, bracing himself. Eric's voice exploded through the receiver, sharp and furious. He wasn't asking about his father's health or the pneumonia that had nearly laid him in the grave. He wasn't concerned about the strain that years of sacrifice had carved into David's body. No, his outrage was about Gregory, about the humiliation of his father daring to refuse him, daring to draw a line. "You embarrassed me," Eric snapped, his tone more cutting than any blade. The words were laced with anger, but underneath was something worse, a complete lack of love. David sat in silence, the fork on his plate, forgotten the weight of his son's fury pressing against his ribs. He had expected anger, yes, but not this cold dismissal of everything he had ever done. He had hoped for hesitation, a crack in Eric's voice that hinted at the boy who once clung to his father's hand. But there was nothing. Eric was no longer speaking as a son. He was speaking as a man whose pride had been bruised in front of in-laws, and a wife who measured status above blood. "Fine," Eric said at last, his voice chilling in its finality. "Keep your money. Stay home alone for Christmas." The words landed with the weight of a hammer driving the last nail into a coffin David had been building with his own sacrifices. It wasn't just the dismissal. It was the ease with which Eric severed the bond, the way he cast aside the man who had once stayed awake through nights of asthma attacks, who had worked until his body broke just to keep his son's world intact. David pressed the phone tighter to his ear, as if forcing himself to absorb every syllable, every ounce of betrayal. His throat tightened, but he didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The silence between them grew thick, suffocating, until Eric, impatient even now, ended the call with a sharp click. The line went dead, leaving David staring at the darkened window, the reflection of a man who no longer recognized the son he had raised. The pain came in waves, raw and merciless. He thought of Christmases past, Karen humming carols as she decorated the tree, Eric's small hands tearing through wrapping paper, the glow of the fireplace as they sat together, a family complete. Those memories, once sweet, now twisted like knives. The boy in those scenes had vanished, replaced by a man who valued appearances over loyalty, who had traded love for pride. Heartbreak hollowed him out, but beneath it something else stirred sharper than grief. Betrayal. It wasn't just that Eric had chosen Melissa's side. It was that he had done it so easily, without hesitation, without even pretending to wrestle with the decision. Blood had meant nothing in the face of status. A father's devotion had been outweighed by the shallow approval of in-laws. David rose from the table slowly, his joints aching, his breath unsteady. He walked through the house, past the photographs on the walls, each one now mocking him with images of a family that no longer existed. His hand lingered on one frame, Eric at his college graduation. Smiling wide, his arm slung around his father's shoulder. "That boy had once promised, I couldn't have done it without you, Dad." David stared at the photo until the edges blurred with tears. The promise had died. He made his way to the living room where Karen's presence still clung to the fabric of the old couch and lowered himself into the seat. The words echoed in his mind, relentless. Stay home alone for Christmas. He realized then that Eric had not only abandoned him, he had condemned him. In those few cruel words, his son had drawn a permanent line severing what remained of their bond. But as the minutes ticked by and the night deepened, the raw pain began to calcify into something else. He had spent years sacrificing giving until nothing was left waiting for gratitude that never came. Now, stripped of illusions, he saw the truth with brutal clarity. His son had chosen pride. Melissa had chosen appearances, and Gregory had chosen power. None of them had chosen him. And yet, there was freedom in that realization. The chains that bound him to their expectations had finally snapped. He was no longer their provider, no longer their silent supporter. They had cut him out, and in doing so, they had freed him. David leaned back in the dim glow of the lamp, his face hardening, his breath steadying. He wasn't the man who bent anymore. He wasn't the man who carried their weight. What remained was something sharper, something colder, something that would not be ignored. The night passed in silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant howl of wind against the eaves. David sat awake, staring into the darkness, not with despair, but with a resolve forged in betrayal. His son had delivered the final break, and with it had given him permission to fight on his own terms. What Eric and Melissa didn't understand was that when you strip a man of everything, his love, his dignity, his place at the table, you create something far more dangerous. You create a man with nothing left to lose. And when Christmas morning came and the house across town filled with lights and laughter, David Harris would already be preparing the reckoning that none of them would ever forget. The morning after that brutal phone call, David Harris woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The ache in his chest from Eric's words was still there, raw and unforgiving, but it no longer consumed him. Something inside had shifted. He stood at the kitchen window, coffee steaming in his hand, and realized the silence in his house no longer felt like punishment. It was freedom. The weight of expectation, the endless drain of sacrifice, the humiliation of being treated like nothing more than a paycheck. It had all been lifted. His son had cut the final tether, and though it hurt, it left him untethered, finally able to breathe. At first, he didn't know what to do with that freedom. The habits of giving, of bending, of erasing his own needs for others had become second nature. He still caught himself reaching for the checkbook when the calendar flipped to the first of the month. But then he'd stop, close the drawer, and let the relief wash over him. No more scrambling, no more late-night shifts just to keep someone else's lights on. The house with its peeling paint and sagging porch felt more like a home now than the mansion he had been financing for years. He began to reclaim his life in small, steady steps. One afternoon he pulled out an old address book, its pages yellowed and curling, and dialed numbers he hadn't touched in decades. Old friends answered, surprised to hear his voice, but welcoming him back without hesitation. Soon he was meeting them for coffee at a diner off Main Street, the kind of place where the waitress knew your order before you spoke. They laughed, they shared stories, and for the first time in years, David wasn't the outsider in someone else's world. He belonged. He reached out to his sister Linda, a woman he hadn't seen much since Karen's funeral. Pride and distance had kept them apart, but when she opened the door and pulled him into a hug, he felt the years melt away. They sat at her kitchen table, the smell of cinnamon rolls filling the air, and talked long into the night. She didn't ask about Eric or Melissa. She asked about him, what he wanted, what he missed, the simplicity of being seen, of being valued for who he was rather than what he could give, filled a hole he had carried for far too long. Soon his evenings weren't spent alone with the hum of the refrigerator. He began attending community dinners at the church gatherings where people brought casseroles and laughter in equal measure. He found himself enjoying conversations with neighbors, some his age, some younger, all of them curious about his stories of construction sites and long nights spent raising a boy on his own. He even started volunteering to fix leaky faucets and patch broken steps for those who couldn't manage it themselves. Each small act rebuilt a piece of his identity, reminding him that he was more than the hollow role his son had carved for him. Christmas came, but for the first time in his life he didn't dread the emptiness of the day. He took a pen to the calendar, crossed out the word Christmas written in bold letters, and replaced it with his own plans. He drove to Linda's, where the house glowed with warmth and children's laughter. The table was crowded with food, the kind of meal that stretched long into the evening, and as he sat with a plate piled high in front of him, he felt something he thought he had lost forever: joy. Not the strained, conditional joy of being tolerated at Eric's gatherings, but genuine, unfiltered belonging. The days that followed brought a rhythm he hadn't known in years. He walked in the mornings, breathing in the crisp air, nodding to neighbors who waved. He repaired his porch, painted the front door, even planted rosemary in Karen's old garden bed, as if reclaiming a piece of her spirit. He hung her wind chimes again, and when they caught the breeze, the soft music filled the house with something more powerful than silence. It was peace. For the first time, David was living for himself. He wasn't waiting for a call that never came, wasn't measuring his worth by his son's approval. He had stopped asking what Eric thought, stopped caring if Melissa sneered, stopped needing the Parkers' validation. They had their world polished and shallow, but he had built a new one, simpler, quieter, but filled with a strength they could never touch. Late one evening, as he sat on his repaired porch with a cup of coffee, he realized he was no longer angry. Anger had burned through him, yes, but now it was gone, replaced by something stronger. Resolve. He had survived betrayal, humiliation, and abandonment, and still he stood. He had endured, rebuilt, and rediscovered a life worth living. But deep inside, under the calm surface, something colder still lingered. They thought he was finished, erased, cast aside to fade quietly into obscurity. What they didn't know was that his peace wasn't surrender. It was preparation. He wasn't done with them, not yet. The day would come when Eric, Melissa, and the Parkers would feel the weight of everything he had carried. And when that reckoning arrived, they would learn the hard way that a man who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man of all. Life has a way of teaching us that love without respect can slowly become a burden, and sacrifice without gratitude can turn into chains. David's story is not only about betrayal, but about rediscovery, the moment he realized that his worth was not defined by what he gave to those who only took. Many older adults know the quiet weight of being overlooked, of feeling like their years of devotion are forgotten. But his journey reminds us that dignity is not something anyone can strip away unless we allow it. Reconnecting with old friends, leaning on family who truly care, and finding joy in community are not small steps. They are acts of reclaiming life. For those who feel abandoned or undervalued, there is strength in choosing peace over bitterness, in writing new plans, rather than waiting for invitations that never come. It's never too late to start living for yourself, to take back your voice, and to find pride in who you are beyond what you've given. If you've ever felt the sting of being taken for granted, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of our strength.